Arjun said, what is the Brahman, or the Absolute? What is the Self? And what is action, O best of the persons? What is to be the domain of the elements? What is called the domain of the gods? What is the domain part of sacrifice in his body? And how, O Madhusūdana, how are you to be known at the time of departure by the self-controlled? You see that the words that the Supreme Soul spoke in the last two verses of the 7th chapter are used by Arjuna in the first two verses of this 8th chapter to ask the Supreme Soul questions in that same order. If you want to look at this word by word, draw a table on your page, split it up into 2 columns and 8 rows. Okay? The first row, first column header, what Shri Krishna says in the last 2 verses of the 7th chapter. That's column header for column 1. Column 2 is what Arjuna asks in the first 2 verses of this 8th chapter. Column 2. So if column 1, what Shri Krishna says in the last 2 verses of the 7th chapter, and column 2 is what Arjuna asks in the first 2 verses of the 8th chapter. So starting off from the first column, which is what Shri Krishna says in the last 2 verses of the 7th chapter, he first says, Kim tad Brahma. You can translate it in English as know the Brahman. For that, Arjuna asks, Tad Brahma Kim. What is Brahman? Next row, Shri Krishna said in the last 2 verses of the 7th chapter, Kim Adhyatmam. Know the self. For this, what Arjuna asks in the first 2 verses of the 8th chapter, Adhyatma Kim. What is the self? Next row, Shri Krishna said, Kim Karma. Know all about action. What's Arjuna's question? Karma Kim. What is action? Then Shri Krishna said, Kim Adibhuta. Know the material aspects. For that, Arjuna asks, Adibhuta Kimuchyate. What is the domain of the elements? Then, next row, Kim Adideva. Know the divine aspects. For that, Arjuna asks, Adideva Kimuchyate. What is the domain of the gods? Then, Shri Krishna asked, Kim Yagna. Know all sacrifices. For this, Arjuna asks, Adi Yagnam Katham Atra Dehesmim. What is the domain part of sacrifice in this body? Finally, in the last row, Payana Kalechitam Te Vidur Yukta Chetasa. Have knowledge of me, Shri Krishna saying, even at the time of departure from here. For that, Arjuna asked the question, Katanti Niyatma Vihi Prayan Kale Katan Gnayasi. How are you to be known at the time of departure? Has everyone got all of those points down? You have. I'll repeat again. So, Shri Krishna says in the last 2 verses of 7th chapter, know the Brahman. Arjuna asks, what is Brahman? Then, know the self. What is the self? Then, know all about action. What is action? Then, know the material aspects. Then, the question is, what is the domain of the elements? What Krishna said, know the divine aspects. The question, what is the domain of the gods? Next row, know all sacrifices. Then question is, what is the domain part of sacrifice in the body? Finally, have knowledge of me even at the time of departure from here. And the question is, how are you to be known at the time of departure? 7 statements made by Shri Krishna in the last 2 verses of the 7th chapter. Arjuna asks questions based on these in the first 2 verses which we've just chanted. Arjuna is asking God, you said that we should know the Brahman, but what is Brahman? In the first line of this first verse in this chapter, 3 questions are asked. What are they? 3 questions are asked. What is Brahman? Next?
What is self?
What is the self? And then?
What is action?
What is karma? What is action? The questions continue in the first verse as follows. What is said to be the domain of the elements? What is called the domain of the gods? Therefore, 5 questions are asked in the first verse. Then in the second verse, Arjuna asks God, what is this domain part of sacrifice in this body? And, O Madhusūdana, you said in the 30th verse of the 7th chapter that such a person remembers you at the time of his departure, but God, how are you to be known at the time of departure? How can one know you during the time of departure and during the last moments? We say that if one remembers the Supreme Soul during their last moments, then liberation is guaranteed for them. And Arjuna says that he accepts this, but Arjuna asks the Supreme Soul how one can remember him during their last moments. This is because we remember that when we were young, we were studying in schools and giving examinations where we had studied for the entire year, but when it came to the time of giving the examination, what happened? We began shivering and we forgot everything. In the same way, God, if we remember you throughout our entire lives, so that we can remember you during our last moments, but during those last moments when death comes and stands in front of us, then God, at that time, will we really be able to remember you? God, how can one remember you during their last moments? These are Arjuna's questions. The 8th chapter of the Gita has begun with questions. I'm saying this to make clear the link between the end of the 7th chapter, which we've just finished studying, and the beginning of the 8th chapter. In the first 2 verses of the 8th chapter, the doubts and questions that have risen in Arjuna's mind are very valuable from a spiritual perspective. They are very important questions. This is because where does spirituality begin from? It begins from what is Brahman? What is karma, actions? What is adhyatma, the self? If one does not know these, then one will not be able to understand spirituality. I always say that Arjuna is very authentic. If he does not understand something, then he immediately asks a question. In one's life, one gets to see very few such authentic people. 2,500 years before today, Socrates, who's heard of him? Socrates. He lived as a philosopher in Greece. He was a very authentic man. He was a very knowledgeable person. When people went to Socrates with questions, then Socrates would ask them questions back in return. Socrates would never give answers to people's questions. I often think that a true guru never answers questions but creates questions. Of course he gives answers, but the answers come from ourselves. One person would ask Socrates, "What is God?" And Socrates would ask this person back, "Who do you call God?" They would answer, "If we knew who we called God, then why would we come here to ask questions? We do not know who you call God." Socrates would then say, "This is remarkable. You do not even know who we call God, and yet you have come here to know the answer to this question. Your very foundation is wrong. If someone comes and asks us where we can find grains, and we ask them a question in return, what are grains, then how can this be? How can you look for grains when you do not even know what grains are? If a person looks for grains but does not even know what grains are, then this is a laughable situation. In the same way, if one does not know who God is and begins looking for God, then such a person, as Socrates says, first you be clear in your mind of what is God, and then if you come to me, then I'll show you where God is. Socrates therefore asked questions in response to questions. Curiosity and thirst for the truth have begun from asking these questions that Arjuna's asked at the beginning of this chapter. That is why these questions are very important. If you look comprehensively throughout the whole Gita, then the questions that Arjuna has asked in these first 2 verses of the 8th chapter are the last philosophical questions in the entire Gita. In the 9th chapter, who knows what the 9th chapter of the Gita is called? It's called Rajavidya Rajaguhya. What does that mean? Raja, what does that mean? King. The royal wisdom and the royal secret. Rajavidya Rajaguhya Yoga. The yoga of the royal wisdom and the royal secret. In that chapter, Arjuna has not asked any questions. In the 10th chapter, Arjuna has asked questions, in particular in the 17th verse of the 10th chapter, but this question is of a different type. Thereafter, all the questions that were asked by Arjuna have a completely different language behind them. For example, at the beginning of the 12th chapter, when Arjuna asks Shri Krishna, out of those devotees who worship God with a form and those devotees who worship God without a form, which of these have the greater knowledge of yoga? These questions have a completely different setup. From the 17th verse of the 10th chapter to the first verse of the 11th chapter, one realizes this. In the 17th verse of the 10th chapter, Arjuna asks questions with words such as Katham, and many times Arjuna asks, Lord, how can one see you? Or God, how can one know you? Until now, that the questions that Arjuna was asking in the Gita were to establish the identity of the truth. They were asked grammatically if there was a third person where Arjuna himself was asking the questions, Shri Krishna was answering the questions, and the truth was something different. That is why Arjuna asked, Kim Brahman? What is Brahman? Brahman was standing right in front of him, and yet Arjuna was asking Shri Krishna, what is Brahman? Arjuna then asked, Kim Adhyatmanam? What is the self? Yet the self was standing right in front of Arjuna as Shri Krishna. Even then, Arjuna was asking what Brahman is and what the self is. The meaning of this is that there are still doubts in Arjuna's mind that maybe Brahman might not be there. This is the question. If you look at it philosophically, then these are the last philosophical questions. After Arjuna got his answers to his questions, then in the 10th chapter, Arjuna says, God, how can I see you? And God, how you manifest? Then Arjuna was not talking about a third person, but this third person now became the second person grammatically. Arjuna asked Shri Krishna directly, God, how can I recognize you? In the 11th chapter, Arjuna asked Shri Krishna, God, how can I see you? In the first verse of the 11th chapter, Arjuna says to Shri Krishna, Madanu grahaya paramam goyam adhyatma samanitam yatva yuktam vachista moyam vigato mama. The supreme mystery, the discourse concerning the self, which you have given out of grace for me, by this my bewilderment is gone from me. Then Arjuna asked Shri Krishna, if you, O God, think that by me it can be seen, then reveal to me your imperishable self, O Lord of Yoga. It says, Manyase yadi chakta maya drasha miti pravo. Arjuna's language changed completely. These questions that were asked by Arjuna in the first two verses of this chapter are very important questions, and they are a very big turning point for Arjuna. Thirdly, the answer is always one, but there are many questions. The more questions a person has, then the more turbulence, the more problems, then the more disorders that the person has in his mind. For ages and ages, human beings have made a mistake. That which we call civilization is nothing but questions that humans have asked. As the times have changed, the answers do not change. Ekam sadatad vipra bodha davanti. The truth is one, but the ways of saying it changes because the questions change. The answer has remained sanatana. What does sanatana mean? Without beginning. Yes. If it's something has no beginning, has no end, it's everlasting. Then the person answering the question may be Shri Ram, Shri Krishna, Lord Buddha, Lord Mahavir, Christ, or anyone, but the answer has remained one while the questions have changed. We'll see a small example. The main problems in today's times have only one answer. What is the first problem and question of today's times? Let's take pollution. There are many types of pollution, for example, water pollution, air pollution, sound pollution, etc. There are many different types of pollutions. What is the answer behind pollution? Why is there pollution? It is one. How has pollution arose? Who knows the answer? Why has pollution arose? People. And going deeper into that, why did people create pollution? And even deeper than that? Even deeper than that?
Lack of respect.
Yes, you're nearly there. Above respect, what comes? Even deeper than respect? Love. Exactly. It rose because we do not have love towards nature. The only one reason why pollution arose, we do not love nature. But if we began loving nature, then no type of pollution will remain. The problem of pollution is very big. Millions of dollars are expended worldwide to reduce pollution, but the reason behind pollution is one, and that is that we do not love nature. The root reason is love. If there is love, then all types of pollution will be destroyed. The answer is one. The second question we have, particularly in India, is that there's a lot of poverty in society. There is an exploitation and divisions between the haves and the have-nots. Why did this happen? Why is there poverty? Anyone guess?
Greed.
And even deeper? Why does greed form?
No love for anybody.
Exactly. The reason for this is that human beings do not have love towards other human beings. That is why there is poverty. The answer has remained the same, love. But if one person had love towards another person, then how would anybody be able to exploit another? No. Would anyone be able to let anyone else be poor? No. Poverty will remain. The answer has always been the same, love. The third big question in today's times is war and genocide. Why do wars break out? We read every day in the newspaper that people were shot in the battlefield and so many people died and so many people went. Why do wars happen? Exactly. The answer is one, and that is no feelings of love. Love towards life this time finishes. We do not love life. If we began loving life, then there would be no reason for war. The fourth biggest problem of today is a strain in relations. For example, between a husband and a wife, between a father and a son, between brothers, between friends, between mother-in-law and between daughter-in-law, as you see on Indian TV programs, between brothers and sisters. A stress has come into these relations. This is a very big problem, and a problem that there is in every house. Why does this problem happen? Is because there are no feelings of love. Human beings do not have love towards themselves, and human beings do not have love towards other human beings. If human beings just had love towards themselves, then all these problems would be solved. I'll say as an example that if there's an argument between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law lasts, and both of them have remained quiet after the argument, if the mother-in-law had love towards herself, then she said that she'll think that my entire life is gone, I'm now 75 years old, so I have little time left to live, let me retire from this kitchen and they can have whatever they want. If they wish to make vegetables, they can make vegetables, and if they wish to make savories, they can make savories. What difference does it make to me? I have a few years left in my life, and therefore I'll do what's good for me, and I'll have love towards myself. The mother-in-law may not have love towards her daughter-in-law, but at least she'll have love towards herself. She should think that she wishes to develop herself. If this happens, then the question does not remain. If there is love, then no problems would remain. There are many questions, but the answer is always one. Arjuna also asks many questions. The first question that Arjuna asks is very important as a question of today's times. Kim tad Brahman? What is Brahman? God begins answering these questions from the third verse. Let's go on to